Welcome to the Cowboy Up Podcast, where talk is all about the West. This episode is brought to you by White Stallion Ranch and Cowboy Spirit Radio Network. Benjamin Franklin is a giant in American history. At age 70, he took a giant gamble and traveled to France in hopes of recruiting the country's much-needed help to defeat the British. His journey is captured in the new miniseries Franklin, starring Michael Douglas and written by Kirk Ellis. Kirk joins us now to give a behind-the-scenes take on stories, stars, production, and more.
Well, Alan's away. Stephen, great to see you. How you doing with the, it's a little warm in Tucson.
It's a little warm in Tucson. I prefer it warm. These old joints of mine don't like the cold, so this is kind of playing to my strength right now. I'm kind of liking the heat.
I like summer just because I get a few things caught up. I'm always running behind. Anyway, today we're welcoming back Kirk Ellis. He was the executive producer and co-wrote the screenplay for the new series Franklin, starring Michael Douglas. It's streaming on Apple. He also co-produced the 2008 HBO miniseries John Adams. And, of course, that garnered 2 personal Emmy Awards for Kirk, and among the series' 13 overall trophies. He's written episodes for other TV miniseries, including Anne Frank, Into the West, Sons of Liberty. He also did the National Memorial Day concert that airs on PBS. Last time he joined us, it was to talk about his book, Ride Lonesome, and it always sticks with me, that conversation we had about the 1959 movie starring Randolph Scott. It just really brought Randolph Scott to the forefront for me. John Wayne we've all heard of, but man, Randolph Scott had a career too, and I see him a lot over at our in-laws' home, and I think about Ride Lonesome. So great to have you back, Kirk. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Good to be back.
Well, you wrote about John Adams, and now you wrote about Ben Franklin. Did you pitch the idea for the Franklin series, or did somebody ask you to write it?
So here's the origin story behind that. In 2005, a wonderful American historian named Stacy Schiff, who's written about everything from the witch trials of Salem to Cleopatra. She has a new book out now on Sam Adams, John's cousin. She published a book called A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America. And it was really the first piece of modern history to resurrect Franklin's 8 years in Paris. During the entire span of the American Revolution, during which he not only secured the French alliance that helped us win the war, but he stayed long enough to also sign the treaty with England that ended the Revolutionary War and that made us an independent republic. It's still regarded as the single most successful tour of duty by any American diplomat since the early years of the Republic. And I actually had known the book because in doing the research for John Adams, Stacy's book had just come out, and it was 2005, and that was the year I was preparing all the treatments and early scripts. So I looked at this book to inform what became the third and part of the fourth episode of John Adams about his experience with Benjamin Franklin in Paris. That was obviously from a very different point of view. So, the movie business is a lot like history. It's not a straight line. It runs in circles. So, flash forward, almost 2 decades, and this book is optioned by producer Tony Krantz and the studio ITV America, and they're looking for a writer to adapt it. And Stacy, who knew David McCullough fairly well, and David and I had become really good friends on the development and shooting of John Adams, she said, you guys should call Kirk Ellis. And so that's how I ended up getting the job. And between the time that I got the initial call in our premiere on Apple this April, that was 6 years. It's just these are major commitments of time in your life.
Wow.
But you may have to make sure they're a subject you're going to want to stick with for a period of time if you're lucky enough to get them made.
Right. Well, I was just talking to somebody unrelated to today's podcast, and we were just talking about the just sort of amazing collaboration of the folks that we now call our founding fathers, and they were young, and yet the wisdom that they had that you'd expect in people far older, and it is so amazing. I think if you look at it, it almost comes off as divine intervention, because
what makes this story different is that Franklin's 70 years old when he goes over there.
Right. He was a different age than a lot of these guys.
Yeah, and he was by far the senior member of the Constitutional, rather the Continental Congress at that point, and he's sent off on a secret mission. Communications are very sporadic in terms of letters getting across the Atlantic Ocean, and letters are stolen, they're steamed open and resealed. Ships are sunk, but he is essentially a one-man operation. And yes, John Adams comes over to support, harass, and impede him, as it turns out, in the latter part of that tour of duty. But that's, I think, what made the story attractive to me, which was it was a way to look at events I'd covered before from a very different lens, and really approached this as a kind of espionage thriller, that was part of it, and also this idea of Benjamin Franklin inventing the idea of America that's still with us as he was trying to appeal to and seduce the French court, and at the same time really discovering himself. I mean, we know Franklin from his inventions and the avuncular portrayals, and yes, even the way the late great Tom Wilkinson played him in John Adams. But this was, I think, and it's why Stacy really wrote the book, which won the Pulitzer Prize that year for history, which is that this was his most important contribution to America, and really to the world. He changed the shape of the world by going as the emissary of a republic to a monarchy to convince King Louis XVI to finance a war against another monarch in a country that they both hated, England, but that would set the stage for the revolution that would ultimately overthrow and kill Louis and Marie Antoinette less than 10 years later.
Did Franklin hate England, or did he just, because you just said that, I mean, did they hate England, or did they just feel like it was time to be free?
We were obviously at war against England at that point, so, the old adage is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that was certainly the appeal to France. But
no, I get the French part.
Yeah, Franklin had very, very personal reasons for wanting to avenge not only his country but also himself on England. He had been our colonial representative for 4 different colonies, and he had, in his own words, he had spent a decade trying to explain England to America and America to England. But in the days following the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, he was called onto the carpet by the British government and humiliated in a place called the Cockpit, which is in the Palace at Whitehall. It's still there. And he never forgot that mistreatment. And so when the time came for him to act on America's behalf to secure an alliance, there was very much a personal level of revenge that went into that.
That is fascinating. And what strikes me is at a time when we had the framers of the Constitution and the Continental Congress. They were so young. You've got Ben Franklin at the age of 70, so he brings something completely different to the table. And him being able to interact with these younger people had to be a challenge at the time.
Well, most people outside of America, not even then called the United States, remember, this is before Treaty of Paris in 1783, most people couldn't find America on the map. They thought it was somewhere near India, or maybe it was outside Africa. But the name Benjamin Franklin resonated. He was not only the best known American, he was the only American really known outside our shores. So it made him the right man for the right mission at the right time.
And he, of course, I think anybody who's even got sort of garden variety American history knowledge, I mean, you know, they know that, as you said, he did the inventions, and he was this and he was that, and the printing and all the little sayings. And what part of his life is the show? What's the storyline also?
So Franklin arrives in offshore. He's blown off course in a terrible storm after a 6-week crossing. He lands about 100 miles off course on the shores of France. That's December 3rd, 1776. He comes back in 1785. The Constitutional Convention is in 1789, and he dies in 1790. So this is very much that last act of his life.
And that is almost divine intervention if you think about when they did it all and when he died.
Yeah, exactly. Now there was a divine providence, as they were the founders were deists, and so there was always that thought of that blind watchmaker who set the world in motion and then let men make of it what they would. But certainly there was this idea that it's in the same way that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson die on the 4th of July, 50 years after independence, to the exact day, if almost the exact hour. Yeah, of course, there's a providential aspect to that.
Absolutely. And just listening to you, this doesn't show research on your part. This actually shows mastery of the topic.
Well, it's funny, when I took on the job, I still had a lot of my old research books, including Stacy's book. And I actually, when we finally met in person, I showed it to her. I showed all my original Post-it notes for the research I'd done on John Adams on that book. And so I was now able to read it again. And I think I ultimately read the book 4 or 5 times to really immerse myself in it and get into Franklin's headspace as opposed to his rivals. And I had all my original research from John Adams, plus the stuff that I was supplementing. And so I've been, if you count the amount of time I spent on Adams and this project, I've really been involved in the world of early colonial America, and certainly revolutionary America, for 12 years. Yeah, I could teach a class. There's no question. And given the retrenchment of the industry in the wake of the strikes, I may be teaching a class. We don't know yet. We'll see.
I like it.
So you said you used 3 words, and I forget 2 of them. One was impede, one was support. Adams went over when Franklin was in France. What's sort of a description of their relationship?
Well, I mean, it's safe to say they were frenemies. Would be the term we use now. I don't think they liked each other very much, and I think that the portrayal of Franklin and Adams, Michael Douglas and Eddie Marsan, in the new Franklin film is a more accurate representation than that between Tom Wilkinson and Paul Giamatti in the earlier Adams film. They were adversaries, and there was a certain amount of pride and hubris that they had individually, and they just had totally different working styles and totally different approaches to life in the French court. Franklin, there's a line in the first episode of the show where Franklin is addressing this group of French gentry hosted by the man who will become one of America's big benefactors during the war. And he says, diplomacy must never be a siege. It must be seduction. And that's really what won us the hearts and minds of the French. John Adams was a bull in a china shop. He couldn't stand delay. He couldn't stand people saying one thing and doing another. And that's how the way business was conducted in France in that period. And indeed, how diplomacy is conducted to this day. But I think that Franklin knew, and we show this in the series, he knew he could use Adams as a bad cop, and sort of send him to Versailles to, break the windows and yell at people, and they'd come back to Franklin and say, well, what can we do if we don't? Can we not talk to this guy? Can we only talk to you? Well, yes, but I'm going to need certain things from this laundry list. So he knew what he was doing there. But when Franklin died in 1790, there's an entry in Adams's journal about it was the largest funeral in American history up to that point. And he's got some entry in his journal like, for even in death, Franklin is the great conjurer. He still seduces everybody. It was me and it was all these other people who got independence. And so he never really forgave him for hogging the limelight.
Well, that's so really, is it fair to sum it up that their differences were more driven by personality and style and approach than any real difference in goals or strategy?
Well, absolutely. They were both there working for America, and they had different ways of doing it. And remember, when Adams gets so frustrated both with Franklin and the French court, he hightails it to Holland, to the Netherlands, and he scores another alliance and a financial windfall there as well. So he's working on his own in what was then called the Low Countries for the same goal as Franklin, and then comes back when it looks like there's going to be some sort of ceasefire in the war, and they can work for a lasting peace on the American continent. So, and they ultimately worked together really, really well. But to do so, they had to put aside their personal differences, and that's a core element to the last couple of episodes of the series.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be any different today if
no, it isn't.
It would be.
That's for
right.
sure.
One of the things that sort of frustrated me when the early reviews of the show, not all of them, but when some of them came out, and this isn't a show you binge, but you want to spend time with it. You maybe want to watch an episode a couple of times and move on. Critics would talk about not a lot of action in the show. Well, there's not meant to be a lot of action. This is a show about diplomacy. It shows you how the sausage is made. It really is in the room where it happened. And I mean that quite literally, because we shot the show entirely on location in France, outside of Paris, in many of the actual places that Franklin and his colleagues had these discussions.
Wow.
So that added an extra bit of verisimilitude to the production, and I think people sense that when it goes in. And as Tim Van Patten, our director, was keen on, the last couple of episodes of the show are really 12 Angry Men. There's only six. There's only six. There's 3 Americans and three Brits, but it's that same sort of focus, going from the epic to the very, very intimate, and really seeing the trade-offs that American independence involves.
So there was only 6, so they weren't twice as angry or anything.
That's right. Yeah.
Well,
and the settings were a lot nicer as well.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back with Kirk Ellis and the show Franklin, starring Michael Douglas on Apple.
Thank you, Russell, Stephen, and Kirk. Some fascinating stories. I often say, you do learn more here by accident than most places by design. My name is Stan Houston, Stan the Radio Man. I'm the leader of the Cowboy Spirit Radio Network. It was about a little over 4.5, almost 5 years ago that finally, after a little bit of nagging, Russell said to me, Stan, I think I'll do this radio thing just so you won't nag me about it anymore. And that was kind of the beginning of the Cowboy Up podcast. Russell joined in, Alan Day joined in, Lynn Weezy came and was a part of the team. And now we're on episode Series 5. How about that? Season 5. And it's going to continue on. Hey, how about you? Right now, some of you have stories, perhaps of the West, stories of growing up, stories of how your life was changed, stories of how you dealt with a terrible tragedy or a tough disease. Everybody has a story, and usually everybody has a story that somebody else could be encouraged by or amused by or find something that's inspirational. Well, I'm in the business of helping people tell their stories, so very much I would be grateful if you'd think about getting in touch with me, because we would like to have you on the radio. And if you have particularly stories of the Western ways and tradition, we'll get you on the Cowboy Spirit Radio Network. But What It Takes Radio will do what it takes, whatever you would like to do to tell the world about some of the things that would be important to all of us, some wisdom, insight, and truth. Please, let's talk about that. So reach out to me at stanhouston@gmail.com, stanhouston@gmail.com. You have something to say, and you need to tell it to the world.
Okay, so Kirk, where are the actors cast? How did you go about doing that?
So this was a really interesting production because the only American in the show is Michael Douglas. Everybody else, including the wonderful young actor Noah Jupe, who you'd be familiar with from A Quiet Place and Ford versus Ferrari and The Undoing, The Night Manager, he's British. And half the cast is French. And we were absolutely insistent with Apple, and we got very little pushback on this, that the show was going to be bilingual in French and English. It's a show about diplomacy, which is often about miscommunication. And it was important that the French actors speak their language and the Americans and Brits speak their language. And those who were bilingual in history or who could be made credibly bilingual for the drama would speak that language. So we had two extraordinary casting directors. Suzanne Smith, who had cast Band of Brothers for Playtone, and in Paris, Julia Ménager, who had cast Call My Agent and Emily in Paris. So between the two of them, they knew the top ranked English and French actors, and we had our pick of them. And we ended up getting this all-star cast of people like Thibaut de Montalembert, who plays the French foreign minister, who's equally as cagey as Franklin, who was one of the stars of Call My Agent, Ludivine Sagnier, a brilliant young leading lady who had been on Lupin, the Netflix show, Eddie Marsan, of course, who's been in everything, including the recent Amy Winehouse biography, Back to Black, who made a totally different John Adams. There's a story about Eddie that even our casting directors didn't know. Eddie was the original choice to play John Adams back in 2007 when we were shooting. But as a result of changes at HBO and the decision to go with more mainstream stars, we went with Paul and Laura, and God bless them, they were great. But I'll never forget being in my office at this sound stages on the outskirts of Paris, and Eddie came into my office and he threw his arms out and he goes, "You didn't forget me," It's the story he tells to acting classes. So we were gifted with these casting directors and these actors, and we literally got our first choice for every part, which doesn't happen a lot. And with that kind of group of collaborators, the journey, and as Tim likes to say, Tim Van Patten, the director, it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. You have to take the journey with people you like, and you have to learn from them. You have to work with them. And this was, for all of us, so-called production veterans, this was the best show we've ever worked on professionally and personally. It was a tough shoot. It was 117 days of shooting. We shot from June 6th, D-Day of 2022, until December 17th of the same year, and it was a full year in post-production. So it was by no means easy in that sense, but it was glorious. There wasn't a day that you didn't want to go to work. And working in the French system, which we were all a little hesitant about, because it's like, well, guys, it's a 10-hour day and a 5-hour work week, and you work with fewer crews, a smaller number of crew members than you would both in America and Britain. We never had a problem making our days. We actually finished the show ahead of schedule and under budget. And I can't remember a day on the production where I wasn't home in my apartment for dinner. And often dinner in a movie at one of the many art houses that were in a 5-minute walking distance of my apartment. So it was that kind of show. And we did this incredible work, and everybody pitched in. It wasn't just me on the scripts. There was a wonderful writer who also lives in Santa Fe named Howard Corder, who came in as we went into production because the scripts weren't ready and we needed a fresh eye on them. And it was great having a collaborator who could sort of take that material and bring it to the next level. And Howard had worked with Tim on Boardwalk Empire and the reboot of Perry Mason. So all these sensibilities that came in, Michael was a very active producer and collaborator about creating his character. And so it was just, I hate to use this analogy because it's a Franklin show, but there was a lot of electricity every day on the set.
So, I've been around everything from feature films to little tiny one-person documentaries, but never involved really in any real way. When you're a screenwriter on set like this, and clearly it was a great set, and your enthusiasm, and it was the best you've ever been on. Do they come to you and say, "Oh, we got to rewrite this"? I mean,
there were changes every day. There were changes every day. I mean, even before we went into production, the last couple of episodes were very different. And when Tim said, "Guys, I really think this should come down to 12 Angry Men," that was a curveball. But you bring a director of his stature on, you're going to get those kinds of last-minute inspirations, and you just got to roll with it. But beyond that, it was tricky because unlike the normal long form where you've got multiple episodes and you're shooting episode 1, you shoot it out, you move on to episode 2, you shoot it out, you're revisiting all these locations, episode 3, you shoot it out, etc. We couldn't do that. It was too expensive. We shot based on the availability of the locations, and we used a technique that's called block shooting, which meant that you shot it like a feature film. So on any given day, you could be shooting, let's say you had 5 scenes you had to get in the can. One of those scenes could be from episode 1, 2 of them could be from episode 3, 1 of them could be from episode 4, and 1 of them could be from episode 8. So that was tricky for every department, especially for the actors. You really needed to understand the chronology of their character. And often we wouldn't have finished scripts for some of those episodes, particularly the latter episodes, but we'd be able to write a scene, that we needed on that day or that we would need that week. Hope to heck that it's all going to look like we knew what we were doing. And guess what? It did. We had a hiatus 12 weeks into the shoot, which was roughly about mid to late August of 2022. And at that point, we were able to catch up, and things got marginally easier for that reason. But these things happen on every set, and when you've got the right group of collaborators, they're never onerous or they're never unpleasant, and you never feel slight it. That was never the case. It was all about making the show as good as it could be. And all that's reflected. All those contributions are reflected in the show itself. Structurally, the show is what we went into production with. None of that changed much. There were individual shifts in the individual scenes and sequences. And in terms of what we shot versus what made it finally onto the screen, I counted only 6 scenes that were lost on the cutting room floor, which is a pretty darn good ratio.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. When I was 8 years old and moved here to White Stallion, High Chaparral was filming, and they shot here from 68 to 72, and they usually shot.
One of my favorite shows.
What's that?
One of my favorite shows.
Oh yeah, you know, I agree. I'm sure I carry a bias, but still. So anyway, they would shoot a lot of times in the summer here at the ranch, and so we had friends or different people. They always wanted to go out and watch them shoot, and nothing made any sense. And of course, you know far better than me. It's a lot of hurry up and wait, and then there's intense action, right, and then there's nothing, and so it's overall pretty damn boring, really. So to watch. But anyway, I asked, even though I was young, I said, well, this doesn't make sense. And they said, well, they're shooting for like 5 different episodes here. And I thought, what a challenge. Even as a little boy, I thought, what a challenge for these actors. They don't even, my God, they're talking about this and then they're that. And you did that with Franklin. It's a challenge.
And that really, I mean, it was extraordinarily well organized. And I've got to give the credit to Tim Van Patten, the director, David Franco, the extraordinary director of photography, and Elliot Matthews, who was our first assistant director. There was never a day when we didn't know what we were shooting. In fact, Tim and David had spent one of their 2 days off over the weekend visiting the locations for that week and blocking out the shots. It was so that kind of professionalism really filtered down through the entire crew. And
that doesn't sound like it was boring.
Yeah, that's what made it such a remarkable shoot. That's what made it so remarkable as a shoot.
When it wasn't terrible to be in France, getting home for dinner and going to the cinema either. It was. No,
it was not. I mean, I think looking back on it, we resisted it for so long because the rumor was it was just going to be too expensive. Let's shoot it in England on these sound stages. Once Masters of the Air is done, we'll use those sound stages. We'll go to France for about 3 weeks as a remote location, or let's look into Eastern Europe, which we did for the European scenes of John Adams. And it was Stacy, to her everlasting credit, who said, "Have you guys thought of going to Paris?" And we hadn't. And it wasn't until we went on a location scout in February before we started shooting. This is about 4 months before we were going to go onto the floor with the show. And our production designer had very strategically set up a trip to these chateaus. And those of us who went on location scout came back going, this is where we're shooting. There's no better place for it. And it makes it, and I think that was such a godsend because when you see the sumptuous nature of the visuals in the series, and those real chateaus, and we shot in Versailles for 18 days during the course of that shoot. Only on Mondays when it was closed to the public, but we shot in the King's bedchamber. Nobody had shot there before, where Franklin and the King finally met. And many of these other places that were off limits. It made a huge difference to the actors, to the crew, and to the way that the show looked.
Wow. You were also an extra. What
yes,
was
I
that
was.
Like?
So the way that came about was we were shooting in France at the height of the COVID pandemic there. The COVID protocols were, for our set, as a result of Apple really being very good shepherds of their shows, our protocols were even stricter than national governments. Those of us who were above the line, writer, director, actors, we were tested 3 days a week to make sure that we were safe to be in close proximity to each other. And we were shooting at a location that's in Saint Denis, not far from the historic church there. There was a girls' school, but it had all of these wonderful 18th century angles to it. And we were shooting a series of sequences where Temple Franklin, played by Noah Jupe, Franklin's grandson, becomes a royal page to the court of Louis and Marie Antoinette. And one of our actors, who was a featured extra, flunked the COVID test. So Tim's looking around for people on the crew who are actually working, so they're safe. He looked around, and I've known Tim for a long time. He looked around and he goes, "You." With me, what he goes, "Old Page, get it." And I literally, it's like, get him in the makeup, etc. So it was a rare opportunity for me, not as the writer, but as the producer of the show, to go behind the scenes and see what it was like a day in the life of a Hollywood extra on the Franklin shoot. And from the moment I was in wardrobe, going through makeup, and of course I knew the wardrobe and hair people, I knew the prop people, but going through as just another schmo on the set, and then doing my stint, my 5 seconds of fame, and I get a nice close up with Noah Jupe. I knew they wouldn't be able to cut that one because I was with number two. I was with number 2 on the call sheet, so that one was going to stay in. It was great. It was just it sort of confirmed the opinion that we all had, and this was fairly late in the shoot, that we had picked the right people who really knew how to be human beings on a film crew, which isn't often the case. And it was I loved it. I loved those days, and it was just a lot of fun. And I think Tim probably put me through a few more takes that he needed, just because he was getting a kick out of me being an extra on the set. And I had to do my lines in French, by the way.
Oh.
So I had to work with the dialect coach, and I'd learned to read French while I was there, and I could understand it after all the time I spent there. But speaking, it was still really tricky. But I got it, and they didn't have to dub my voice in post-production. That's really me. So I pat myself on the back that the €1 that they paid me for that day's work was not ill spent.
€1.
Yeah. I'm sitting here, Kirk, and I've got a different appreciation for Ben Franklin than I had 45 minutes ago. Did you come away with any changes in what you thought?
Oh yeah, we were working with a different perspective of Franklin than I'd certainly written before, and than anybody's really portrayed before. And I don't really think it was until I saw Tim's director's cuts coming out of the cutting room and how well Michael's performance had come together, that slyness, that twinkle, that seductivity, the arrogance that was often expressed in the relationship he had with John Adams, and also the constant rivalry he even had with his grandson, which is what people really latched onto in the show, because they can see a lot of their own family dynamic in that. So I don't think it's really until I saw how Michael's performance had come together that I went, yeah, now that's a Franklin nobody's seen before. Not everybody may like it, and some people haven't, but it's true to the man. It's absolutely true to Benjamin Franklin in that period, and without that iteration of Franklin, we'd still be a British colony. No question.
Interesting.
Well, we've run out of time. Franklin on streaming on Apple, is that correct? How many episodes?
8 episodes. 8 episodes. Watch him leisurely, with some cheese and a glass of wine. Think about him, talk about him, and then go to the next one.
Great. And what's next for you?
Well, who's to say at this point? My current project is actually, I'm writing another book for the University of New Mexico Press. It's a much longer book than the one I wrote for their Real West series, and it's using the production history of the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, directed by Arthur Penn, with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, as a lens through which to look at America's cult of the outlaw and how that relates to our obsession with firearms. And that's due out in the spring of next year.
Wow. And that is so true. Cult of the Outlaw. I mean, we just came from New Mexico, and it was Billy the Kid this, Billy the Kid that. I mean, if he might have been there, he had a picture. I mean, it's a guy who died at 21 years old.
Inevitably, he's a figure in the book as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
He'd have to be. Well, anyway, and also just to revisit to your book, Ride Lonesome, about that 1959 movie starring Randolph Scott that you consider a standout Western and of course, among Randolph Scott's pretty lengthy resume. So, yeah. Kirk Ellis, thank you so much. And Franklin on Apple is the place to be.
Eye-opening.
Thank you very so much, guys. Always great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for tuning in today, and thank you, Stan Houston, for making this episode possible. This is the first episode of Season 5. Stephen Clausen is joining the podcast, and I am bowing out. It's been an honor, a pleasure, and just a ton of fun to work with this wonderful, talented, and authentically Western podcast team. I'll need to visit occasionally, okay, gang, as I've come to love the ranch, and will, of course, tune into every episode, as I hope you will, too. So, until we meet again, this is Lynn Weezy Sneed reminding you to sit tall and ride safe.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling until then.
Who cares about the clouds